Hi, good afternoon. Welcome to the seminarians, priests, philosophy students, philosophy professors who might be interested in following this lecture aside from the regular class that's holding it. This is the first in what I hope will be a series of lectures in philosophical theology centering on the thought of Whitehead and Hartshorne. Now, even if philosophical theology, or what has been traditionally called theodicy, has been on the philosophy curriculum for a long time, I think that it profits us, priests, seminarians, and philosophy majors in general, to entertain and to be serious with alternative concepts of God other than the traditional concept that we have. I am not saying that we have to discard, let us say, the Thomistic concept of God. I'm only saying that it might be helpful to entertain alternative conceptual approaches to the problem of God, especially, number one, if these approaches have a closer affinity to science. It is preferable to have a philosophy that echoes with science rather than a philosophy that is very difficult to reconcile with what science tells us. And number two, an alternative conceptuality is preferable if such an alternative allows us to solve problems in philosophical theology that past concepts were unable to solve. And let us be honest that one of the most vexatious problems for philosophical theology has always been the so-called problem of evil. Now, of course, if you accept evil as a given, evil as a fact that needs no explanation, then it is not a problem. The only philosophical problem that remains is to try to figure out what evil is. Now, yeah, Elijah, I see that you're in, and Brian, I I also see that, and yes, I know that Archbishop Cruz passed away. Okay, now here's the point. However, if you combine the problem of evil, why evil exists, and the traditional concept of God as omnipotent and omnibenevolent, then you really have a problem. Why? Because if God is good and He has the power to prevent the evil from taking place, an earthquake, a typhoon, an epidemic like COVID 19, and He does not, then His omnibenevolence becomes questionable because the COVID epidemic has killed so many, has ruined so many lives, and despite that, the God who is supposedly able to put an end to it does not. On the other hand, if you say God loves us so much and really wants to end the epidemic, but there is nothing He can do about it, His omnipotence becomes a matter of issue. And the traditional doctrine has always been that God is omnipotent and can do anything that He wishes. So there you see, The problem actually comes in because of our traditional notion of God, coupled with the ineluctable fact that in the world there is evil. Um, yes, we deal with the evil that is traditional called physical evil. These are the natural disasters that occur, and that which is also called moral evil, the evil that arises from bad, immoral, evil decisions. And of course, you can always say, well, God can do nothing about the freedom of the human person, which is also correct. But still, if you maintain this concept that God is in full control of all circumstances in the world and can stop a dagger from penetrating the belly of a victim, for example, then you must ask why he did not do that if he can really do that. And that is the reason that when an alternate conceptuality of God comes around and is proposed in a coherent, sustained, and well argued manner as that which Whitehead and Hartshorne do, so called strands of process philosophy, then I think it's worth entertaining. The second introductory remark I'd like to make is that even if we are treating Whitehead and Hartshorne together, please let us not think that Charles Hartshorne was a disciple or a mere continuation of Whitehead. No. In fact, each is an independent philosopher. Whitehead is a process philosopher, as is Hartshorne. And while Hartshorne was tremendously influenced by Whitehead, that is not to say that Hartshorne does not part ways with Whitehead on many significant points that we shall later call attention to. So it's wrong to think that Hartshorne is a mere commentator or a mere continuation of Whitehead. He is an independent philosopher with a unique thought of his own. Now, however, because of the commonality between these two philosophers, there are too many elements that they hold in common to be overlooked. And because Hartshorne frequently refers to Whitehead, then there is justification in treating them together. And the moment we do that, we will have to recognize that other philosophers should be in the same boat. John Cobb, David Griffin, as examples. And I'd like to pay tribute here to a professor of the Catholic University of Leuven, Professor Jan van der Weyken, who was my professor during the period of my postdoctoral fellowship in Belgium, and who was also the professor of Father June Castañeda, who did his PhD at the Catholic University of Leuven. In fact, many of us Filipinos, including Father Ferdy Santos, were students of Professor Jan van der Weyken, and I owe him a lot for having introduced me to the beauty and to the promise of process philosophy. One thing that I must tell you is that when we approach a new philosophical system like this, we must be willing to build on new ground. While Whitehead, of course, does not philosophize out of the blue, he is always in a context. The same thing can be said with Hartshorne. Nevertheless, they tell us things that take us away from our habitual way of looking at things. Okay, the next and probably final introductory remark I will make is that in Whitehead, the concept of God is merely a part of his entire metaphysical project. In short, the direct thrust of Whitehead is metaphysics. Whitehead wants to give the world an account of reality, an account of being. And God comes into the picture because God figures as one, may I repeat that, as one of the elements constituting Whitehead's picture of reality. So I repeat, Whitehead is not an ex-professo philosophical theologian. Of course, he engages in philosophical theology because he has to talk about God. But he talks about God not because God is his principal interest, but because God is indispensable to his discussion of the nature of reality, which is his real purpose. Hartshorne, by contrast, really sets out to do philosophical theology. From the very beginning, Hartshorne is a philosophical theologian. And if he makes remarks in metaphysics, such as in the logic of perfection, where he attempts to rehabilitate, I don't know if that's the felicitous word for it, where he tries to rehabilitate the ontological argument of St. Anselm and other things, as well as clarify for us the logic that goes into the concept of perfection. Hartshorne is through and through a philosophical theologian. And therefore, that alone is an initial difference between these two great people. Okay, so let's start with Whitehead. I just like to make certain things clear first. In Whitehead, what exists is known as an actual entity or an actual occasion. Therefore, whenever I say actual entity or actual occasion, I mean the thing that exists. Now, as the term suggests, an occasion should not be thought of in the same way that we think of an Aristotelian substance or a monad in the philosophy of Leibniz. An actual occasion comes into being and ceases quite speedily. And the actual occasion that came into being and then that ceases to exist is succeeded by another actual occasion. Now, so the question you might ask might be, well, if that is your account of reality, why then am I here? And why can I last for some time? For example, for the whole period of this lecture. Why are you there? And why can you last for the whole period of this session with you? Well, the answer is because I am not an actual occasion only. I am a society of actual occasions rapidly succeeding each other. And there you see the kinship between Whitehead's philosophy and science Because that's exactly what science tells us also. Biologically, chemically, electrically, atomically, we never remain the same. Changes constantly, fleetingly occur in us, such that what Heraclitus said centuries ago seems to be very true now. Although, of course, can and should understand it in a way that Heraclitus never understood it. Okay, so once more, that which we call thing is what Whitehead calls actual occasion or actual entity. Now, here's a very important principle. Aside from actual occasions or actual entities, there is nothing real. May I make that clear? Aside from actual occasions or actual entities, there is nothing real. Now, if you maintain that kind of an ontology and you want to talk about God and you want to assert the reality of God, you are forced by that ontology to say that God has to be an actual occasion. That God has to be an actual entity. Like all of us, all realities are actual occasions or actual entities. This is a very important thing to remember because Whitehead so often says, when we talk about God, we should not make him the exception to all our metaphysical principles just to prop up our metaphysics. Rather, God should be the exemplar of all metaphysical principles. So if we say that anything real, anything actual, anything existing is an actual entity or an actual occasion, then God has to be an actual entity or an actual occasion. Now, there is a philosopher from long ago whom very few paid attention to, but who we must now pay attention to because of the affinity of his thought to the thought of Whitehead and Hartshorne. And this is Baruch Spinoza. Many times in the West, his name is Benedict Spinoza. But he's actually Baruch Spinoza, who was a Jew. And even as a Jew, he was disliked by many Jews because of what they thought to be his unorthodox views. You know, one of my current projects, although I don't know when I get the time finally to write the whole thing, is to write a book on Spinoza in an attempt to show how Spinoza's concept of God can be a very useful concept for us today. A few years ago at the Catholic University of Leuven, Professor de Schrijver, one of the leading philosophers there, presided over a seminar which was entitled Naming God Today. And the whole thrust of his lecture was, how can we approach God in a manner that is acceptable rather than contemptible in an age that is enamored by science? Of course, you can say the enchantment with science has passed. The postmodern temper is no longer as enamored with science as it used to be. But like it or not, if you make a student who is not sophisticated choose between a philosophical statement and a scientific statement, he will be dazzled by all the proofs, the experiments that the scientists can offer, and will not pay much heed to to the arguments that a philosopher can offer. So there's this continuing fascination with science. And because of that, Spinoza's philosophy, which puts a premium on the world, which is why his view is often called pantheism, seems to be a very, very promising alternative as long as we can work it out along the lines of the arguments of Whitehead and Hartshorne. By the way, for us priests and for you seminarians who are listening, entertaining an alternative concept of God is not necessarily heretical. The moment, of course, you say there are 3 gods, there are 4 gods, 5 gods, 6 gods, whatever it is, or there is 1/2 God, then you really are in heresy. But for as long as you try to understand for yourself and make sense of the concept of God, that is not a heresy. In fact, that is the task of an earnest Christian. This whole Anselmian concept of fides quaerens intellectum, faith seeking understanding, should inspire us all. It continues to inspire me. Okay. Now, like Spinoza, Whitehead posits that there is an ultimate reality that actualizes itself in all entities. Now, I said a moment ago that the only thing that exists is an actual entity or an actual occasion. But underlying all the actual occasions is what we might call substantial activity or creativity. Now, let me make this clear, please. Do not think of creativity as the creation of God. That's not it. And do not think of creativity either as yet another entity. Creativity is not an entity. The only things that exist, I repeat, are actual entities, actual occasions. But the very interesting thing about these actual occasions, as I told you a while ago, is that they don't stand still. One actual occasion comes into existence and ceases. Another actual occasion takes its place. Not only that, the ongoingness of the universe by which actual occasions come into being and cease out of being does not bring about chaos. It doesn't bring about chaotic circumstances. Rather, there is order. We exist. Things exist. There is stability in the universe. Now, the ongoingness of things, the sheer ongoingness of things, that is what we call creativity. So I repeat, creativity is real only insofar as it is manifested by actual entities. I have to repeat this. The creativity we're talking about in Whiteheadian philosophy is not the creativity of God. God will come into the picture, yes. But for now, it is not the creativity we think about when we think of creativity in Thomistic philosophy. In Thomistic philosophy, we say, creare est aliquid facere ex nihilo sui et subjecti. No, that's not what we're talking about. Creativity is the substantial activity that manifests itself in the ongoingness of actual entities or actual occasions. So the only things we have in the universe actually are actual entities. But in their coming into being and ceasing out of existence and the succession of actual occasions, we find the manifestation of substantial activity or creativity. So when we say substantial activity, we mean the fact that events occur. The sheer fact that something happens, universal ongoingness. And here it is. Creativity is a basic fact that is not subject to explanation. In other words, let's not ask, well, but who brought about creativity? Creativity is the very nature of reality. Creativity is the very nature of reality. Creativity is a basic elemental fact with which we must deal. May I call to mind the descriptives I just used? It is the sheer ongoingness. It is the fact that events occur. It is the fact that something happens. And finally, let me say that creativity is absolutely valueless in the sense that it is value neutral. Creativity is absolutely formless. Creativity, or the ongoingness of the universe, is what explains why viruses like COVID come into being. It is what explains why very dangerous bacteria and pathogens exist. But creativity is also what explains why such a beautiful and complex thinking, reflecting, speaking creature like a human being can exist. That's creativity. In the next session, I shall take up with you how God enters into the picture with this account. So I hope to see you again at the next live session. Or for those who are following me asynchronously, you can always listen to this taped or to this live stream lecture. Thank you very much.